Okay, so for the neckline and the facing, so this is our front piece and it has a dart, so you can practice the dart here as well. And so just a reminder, we are always marking everything on the inside, so on the left side of the fabric. So this is on the inside of the garment. Okay, so if you have fusing and you have applied it here, that's great. If you haven't, that's also okay. But basically facings are usually fused. I think I also call it interfacing. It is just another layer that we iron on to make it more stable. And generally speaking, in sewing, we always want to put right side on right side. So this is obviously the inside or the left side of my fabric. And this is the right side, and this is the right side. So we want to stitch the neckline. So we're putting right side on right side along the edge. This time we have a curve. So you may need a few more pins than we have so far on our straight seams. It's only a small, only half a front neckline, so it's not very long. That would be good to practice. Okay. So we have still 1 cm seam allowance. So like I said before, you can mark it. You can stitch on either side, this one or this one, it doesn't matter. And you want to back stitch on both ends. So if you have it marked on, or if you may feel like the straight line was okay, but here you want to go with the line on it, you can go for it. You can mark it. So your marking will start here, because here we have the shoulder seam. But our sewing always starts from the edge of the fabric, never just from the seam. So doing a back stitch, a few stitches backwards. And then slowly following the curve. All the way to the end, and you back stitch again. Okay, so we've done our seam, and now we have to slip the facing around to the inside of the garment, right? Because we're stitching on the right side, but now we need to get to the bagging out part, where we're kind of finishing off this edge here with the facing piece. At the moment, it doesn't really want to go there yet, or at least it won't give us a nice curve. So what is really important when we have a curve, a particular curve like this, that we have to snip into the seam allowance all along the curve. Sometimes I would also recommend kind of snipping in a little bit like this to actually remove some of the fullness. For example, in bust cut areas, things like that. Or the other option is to actually, so because now if I fold this around, you can see on the inside, the seam allowance can spread apart, right? The other option is to also just trim the seam allowance. And you can always try, you will feel the difference when you turn this around, how it will sit. I don't know if you remember when I just did it at the beginning, it would not sit like this. Obviously, depending on your fabric, you might see the snip, so that's where you want to consider to do it or not to. And even when I do it, I like to still trim the seam allowance a bit, so that you do not see as much of the seam allowance through in thickness and in shape. And we turn this to the other side, And now we are on the inside of the garment, and you can see the seam here on the edge. Okay, so this is, now before we could press it in place like this, but then what could also happen, we could press it with the seam rolling to the outside. Usually it goes a bit in, a bit out, and that's not what we want. So we are going to add an internal flat stitch. How do we do that? So all facing should have an internal flat stitch, almost always. So we are placing our iron on the side of the front, and we're pushing the seam allowance towards the neck. Yeah, so this time it's a little bit harder because we have, so kind of what we did for the closed seam, but this time we have a curve, right? So it's a little bit trickier. However, you don't need to go over it and flatten it because that will not work. There's a curve here, so you only do a little bit at a time. Yeah, so once you've completed pressing all your seam allowances towards the facing, go back to the sewing machine, and we're going to put a top stitch. Yeah, we call it an internal flat stitch because we'll be only on the inside. Remember, the top stitch before was on the outside of the garment. This is the internal flat stitch, but how you do it is exactly like a top stitch. And I'm going to add it on the side of the facing with the seam allowance towards the facing. Okay, so now back on the sewing machine. Again, we are stitching always, so when you have a facing, you're doing an internal flat stitch, it's always on the facing because that sits to the inside. And remember, I was saying that the top stitch is not, or the stitching is not visible from the outside. So this is where you want to stitch, and the important part is that the seam allowances are towards the facing side. And this stitching is usually right next to the edge, so again like a 2 millimeter or something like that. Not usually a 6 millimeter. Here I started too close to the end, that I was explaining to you before. So that's why usually I start a few millimeters in, then go forward and go backward and go again. Because when you start too close to the edge, sometimes it just tangles. So I'm just going to cut this off and start again. So now I'm kind of pulling them apart, making sure that I don't let anything of my curve. Remember, this is a curve now. I don't want to kind of accident stitch this way. I need to open this up the whole time and drive along it. And you want to make sure that your seam allowance doesn't fold by accident into this direction. It has to remain towards your facing. Get to the end and back stitch again. This is what it should look like on the inside, and this is what it's on the outside. And then the moment you flip it over, it should sit really nice and neat. I'm gonna go and press. Okay, so this time, if you're trying to press this, you will see that it automatically rolls in the direction with the seam showing here by a millimeter. Of course, it could be more as well, particularly on a straight piece, but you want to make sure it's not too much. But it should not. It actually struggles, so I'm trying to push it now in the other direction, let's say, because this is the outside of the gun. We don't want to see the seam, but it's really hard now to pull it out because of the internal flat stitch. Yeah, so that's the whole point. I usually press first from the side so I can see and make sure that the seam sits back evenly around a millimeter. Once I've done that, I also press the outside, and now you can see your front neck facing with the internal flat stitch. So that's on the outside, we don't see anything, just a really neat clean edge. So So this can be used anywhere, on the armhole facing, on kind of any kind of cutouts, the waistband on the skirt, so not the waistband, the waistline on the skirt where we have a facing instead of a waistband. And this is the inside.